Chapter 10. When it rains, it pours. The last weekend of the summer meant I had to do something that I'd been avoiding for years. I had to finally cut my hair. I would definitely not be able to battle and beat the Catholic military school I was going to in Manhattan like I had beaten Sister Marie. My brother warned me that they would not tolerate anything against the dress code, which was basically a full suit. We had to wear our own shirt and tie every day, as well as a blazer that was part of the school uniform. The other major rule was, just like my grammar school, no hair touching the collar. What a joke. I was regretting my decision to go to this school before I even started, but I did what I had to do. I got my hair cut just above my collar, and I absolutely hated it. All of my friends said they didn't even recognize me. I think my hair had been growing long since 2nd or 3rd grade at this point. They hadn't seen my hair this short since the 1st or 2nd grade. I just didn't look or feel like myself. Not only did I hate the way it looked, I hated having to compromise what I wanted and what I believed in just for someone's stupid rules. This wasn't a good way to start high school. It was one of the only times, if not the only, that I compromised myself. I went into the first day of school totally resenting them already. All was okay for the first few months until one day on my way to class, the dean pulled me into his office and asked me to turn around. I really had no idea what he wanted, but I knew it couldn't be good. He said, "We have a problem here. Do you know what it is?" I replied, "No, I don't," with a little bit of an attitude. He said, "Your hair is way too long." I couldn't believe it. I had just battled for the last 3 years against the most evil person in the world, and now I would have to start all over again. The dean handed me a large pair of scissors. These were no regular scissors. They had the perforated edges that they use for art projects. He said, "Go cut your hair in the bathroom and come back to me in 10 minutes. If it's still touching the collar, you're expelled." I thought to myself, what a fucking joke. Another power-hungry asshole that had to prove his worth by bossing around little kids. At first I thought, no, I won't do it. But then I thought about my mom and how disappointed she would be if I got expelled. So I went to another classroom where my friend was and told the teacher that I needed to see him, and that it was an emergency. Once out of the classroom, I handed him the scissors and informed him that I needed him to cut my hair. He looked at me like I was crazy, but gladly went along. He figured at the very least this would be a great story to tell all of our other friends. About 10 minutes later, I returned to the dean's office with the back of my hair completely mangled. Not only from the perforated scissors, but from my friend not knowing what the hell he was doing. As much as I disliked the school already, this little incident really made me feel like I was in the wrong place. From that moment on, I was just going through the motions. I knew in my heart that I could not take another year of this school. I had to do what I wanted to do, and that was play my drums. I never said anything to my mom, but I began cutting classes a lot. Sometimes I would just sit in the library at school just so I could write songs or read the newest issue of Modern Drummer magazine. I was miserable. The only thing about the school that I enjoyed was playing on the football team, where I was co-defensive captain. I vaguely remember overhearing my coach say that he wanted me to be quarterback, but I was too big and he couldn't waste my size. He needed me on defense. I remember the first time we lined up in practice for a sprint. I was easily the biggest kid. The coach blew the whistle and I took off. Turns out, not only was I the biggest kid, but I was the fastest. My buddy O'Grady and I were neck and neck, but I pulled it out at the last second. I ran something like a 4.7 that freshman year of high school. Back then I had no idea what that meant, but now I know how good it really was. The football field was the only place in that school where I fit in. Once the school year was over, I told my mom that I did not want to go back there. I knew I had failed a lot of my subjects and I didn't even care. I think subconsciously I might have even failed them on purpose. I told my mom that I wanted to go to a music school. She was disappointed, but she understood. Once again, my mom not only didn't stand in the way of my dream, but she helped me open the door to get closer to it. She came home with a few school brochures one day, and we both found the perfect place. It was a performing arts high school in Manhattan, the place that the TV show Fame was based on. My mom called to set up an audition. I prepared a little piece and a few weeks later went down to the audition. It was pretty easy and I got accepted. Unfortunately, there was one major problem. Because I hadn't taken all of their music classes the year before, and because I failed a lot of subjects at my old school, I would be way behind. Luckily, I wouldn't have to take my whole freshman year over, but I would have to take half freshman classes and then slowly catch up. The summer of 1989 was nothing like the year before. It actually turned out to be one of the worst summers of my life. One day in late August, we got a call that my grandpa had been rushed to the hospital and we needed to get over there as quickly as possible. He had been sick with emphysema for a long time because of his smoking, one of the main reasons I've never even tried a cigarette in my whole life. I grew up around constant smoking and saw how sick my grandfather had been because of it. Even my mother was already showing signs of its effects. My grandpa and I were very close. He was the only father figure that I had ever really known, and the sweetest, gentlest man on the whole planet. He had been in and out of the hospital for a few months, but him dying never crossed my mind. No one in my family or anyone I had ever known had ever died. He was in ICU the last time I saw him. My mom, brother, and I, along with my 2 aunts, went to the hospital. My grandmother didn't come because she rarely left the house. Actually, the only time she ever went outside was to come visit us in Brooklyn. When we got to the hospital, I just thought Grandpa would be like he always was when he was sick in the hospital. Lying in bed, kind of weak, but still himself. He'd still be Grandpa and still be joking around with me. When we finally got to his room, someone was lying in bed with a tube coming out of his nose. Red liquid was pouring through it. The man lying there was swollen and looked almost Asian to me. My mom and aunts immediately began crying, but I was confused. I didn't understand. There was no way that this man that was lying down in this bed was my grandpa. How could it be? My mom hugged me and said, "That's Grandpa, Joey. Talk to him. Let him know you're here." As I got closer, I could see in fact it was my grandfather. But he was so badly swollen that I didn't recognize him. He was bleeding internally, and the liquid coming from the tube in his nose was his blood basically draining from his body. Even though he was unconscious, I grabbed his hand and held on more tightly than I'd ever had in my whole life. He began rubbing my fingers with his thumb just like he always did. He knew I was there for him. Finally, after a few minutes, the nurses came in and asked us to leave. My mom told me to kiss him goodbye and tell him that I love him. And that's exactly what I did. I kissed my favorite man on earth goodbye. As soon as I left the room, I broke down like I had never before. The walk from my grandpa's room to the waiting room was the longest walk of my life. A few minutes later, the doctor came out and told us that he had passed. He said we could see him if we wanted. My mom, brother, and 2 aunts went, but I couldn't. It was the first time and maybe the only time in my life that I was too weak and too scared. I couldn't make that walk again and see him. I regret every day not seeing my grandpa one last time. Something else strange happened that summer. 2 people came to our house and began looking around all of the rooms. My mom explained something to us that I didn't quite understand at the time. Something about how those people were going to be helping us pay the mortgage in some way. I didn't really understand, and I didn't really care. I had just lost my grandpa, and that was all that was on my mind. I would learn later that year that we might be losing our house. This news was unimaginable to me. This was my home. This was the only place I'd ever lived. There was no way we were losing it. Even though my father was rarely around, there was no way he would let this happen. Was there? The school year began and I actually totally forgot all about the house troubles. It was too unfathomable to me to even think about that anymore. At least until later that year when the police came to evict us. They were literally at the door telling us we had to leave immediately. My mother somehow convinced them to give us 1 week to vacate. I couldn't believe it was happening. We had 1 week to not only find another place to live, but to pack up everything we ever owned. I saw this stuff in the movies, but I never thought it was real. I never thought they could actually throw a family out onto the street. My father never paid the mortgage, and sure enough, we were getting evicted from the only place I'd ever called home. It was one of the most heartbreaking times of my life, and I can't imagine what my mother felt. Her sons, for whom she'd done everything for, were about to be thrown out of their home. While my brother and I began packing our lives into boxes, my mother was searching for a new place to live. I didn't know what we were going to do. If we had no money to pay for this house, how could we move to another? After a week of crying and packing in complete disarray, my mother said she had found a small house that we could rent. It was in the Bergen Beach section of Brooklyn, about a 10-minute drive from the house where we were getting evicted from. A 10-minute drive doesn't seem like much, but for a kid it might as well have been 100 miles. I would be far from my friends. But that wasn't my worst worry. What about my drums? They were my life. My room in my current home was enormous, and I could play the drums in there anytime I wanted to. How could I do so in this new home? My mom assured me that we would figure it out. 1 week later, my biggest nightmare came true. The marshal and the police came back to officially put us out. We had the moving van there that morning, and we were just about out of the house. I remember telling my friends that we had sold the house and we were moving because the neighborhood was starting to go down. It was a complete lie. I was too ashamed to say we were getting thrown out because my father didn't pay the mortgage. So, in April of 1990, my brother, my mother, my grandmother, who was now living with us full-time, Yukon and our cat Tabby, and I, of course, left our home, never to return. This was a day that would have repercussions on my life for years to come. I was never the same after that day. I like to think I was always a loving, sweet boy who always hoped and assumed the best in people and in the world. But after the day we were literally thrown out of our home, I changed. I became angry, more unforgiving, and I downright didn't trust people. Besides my family and friends, I had no use for anyone in the world. I made a promise to myself that day that I would bury myself in my music until one day I was a big enough star and made enough money to buy my mom her house back. Once we moved into the new house, which was about a third the size of our old house, I knew I had to start getting more serious about my music career. The performing arts school I was attending wasn't what I hoped it would be. I guess school is school, and even though I played drums for some part of the day, it still felt like school. I never really became friends with anyone at the school because I didn't want any distractions from my goals. I had my friends from grammar school, and I didn't really need any more. Creation was writing some good songs, but I knew that they weren't good enough to get me to the next level where I wanted to go. This was where I came up with the strategy of playing with as many people and as many bands as I could. I figured that the more people I played with, the more of a chance I'd find the right band and be able to succeed. As coincidence would have it, Scally's brother Matt said that he had a friend that was looking for a drummer. I asked Scally to get me a tape of their songs so I could check them out first. This was another one of my new rules. No wasting time on amateurs. I needed a band that was serious, had great players, and most importantly, had great songs. I got the tape and played it on my stereo that I recently set up in my new room. The tape was labeled Seventh Heaven. I kind of liked it, and the songs sounded great. They were poppy and commercial sounding, sort of like Bon Jovi. I called Scally right away and told him to have his brother set up an audition. The audition would take place at the same studio where I met my first band, Menace, Sync the Pink Studios. This time it would be in the big room, which was kind of famous in my neighborhood because it had such a giant stage and also a giant drum set. When I walked in and saw the stage and drums, I loved it. I already felt like I had taken the next step from my previous bands. Not only were these new songs really good, but they obviously thought big, and so did I. It's funny how little things like renting the big room set a perception of someone for me back then. These were the types of little things that a kid latched onto in order to form a first impression. And my first impression of this new band was great. I met the guys in the band and also their manager. Having a manager was another one of those things at that age that made a big impression. Wow, a manager? This was serious, I thought. They informed me that they didn't have a singer yet and that they wanted to solidify a drummer first. They had asked me to bring down a tape of me playing also. I brought down a song I recorded with one of my classmates at school. We had a classroom where we could write and record our own songs. After handing them the tape with my name and phone number on it, they said, "Let's jam on the songs we gave you." Even though I hadn't yet set up the drums in my new house, I learned the 2 new songs they had given me. They were pretty easy, but I hadn't actually played them on a drum set yet. As soon as we started the first song, I knew it felt right. These guys could really play. This sounded like a professional band and was leaps and bounds over the other musicians and bands I had played in. After we jammed on their few original songs, they asked me if I could do a little solo to just show off some of my chops. I definitely didn't have anything prepared or practiced, so I went to an old faithful, a combination of the Eric Carr solo from the Animalize Uncensored video and Peter Criss's solo from a live one. They seemed to like it. When I was done, they said they would give me a call and let me know if I had made it in the band or not. The next day, I planned on setting up my drums in my new house. My mom and I were in the living room polishing them, and there was a knock at the door. It was the keyboardist and the manager from the band. It turns out that I still had my old phone number on the tape I had given them, and they had no way of getting in touch with me. Even Scally didn't have my new number yet. Luckily, Scal had already been to my new house and remembered where it was. The manager told me that they didn't even want a day to go by without me hearing from them. They liked me that much. They wanted to make sure I didn't join another band before they could get back to me. They told me I was in if I wanted the gig. Of course, I said yes. They left and my mom and I celebrated. Even though we had just lost our home and been forced to pack up everything we owned in a week, we still had each other and I still had my dreams. Unfortunately, the excitement didn't last long. A few days later, I received a call from their manager. He informed me that a drummer that they knew approached them and told them that his uncle could get them on the TV talent show Star Search if he was accepted into the band. Star Search was a really big deal back then. It was like the American Idol of the 80s and the 90s. It was an opportunity they just couldn't pass up. He thanked me for everything and told me to stay in touch. I was upset, but I totally understood. About a year later, I found out that they never even made it to Star Search. The drummer strung them along and never came through on his promise. Years later, Seventh Heaven tried to steal the song I had on my audition tape. Lawyers got involved, and it was pretty messy. In my new house, the drums were set up in my bedroom, which happened to be in the front. After only a few days, we started getting complaints from the neighbors. No matter how much soundproofing I put up, it would never stop the sound from escaping the front window. It was just too loud for all my new neighbors, and I had to figure out something to do. I had the big bedroom, my mother had the medium bedroom in the center, my brother had the basement, and my grandmother was supposed to be in the small bedroom in the back. Because we had some kind of old-fashioned heating system, though, the heat would come from the basement, then shoot up through 2 large vents. This caused my grandmother's bedroom to be way too cold, and she said she couldn't sleep in it anymore. She was basically staying in my room with me every night on a pull-out sofa. Because of this, the small back bedroom wasn't being used. My mother suggested I take over her bedroom for my drums. It was smaller than mine, so she figured we could soundproof it more easily, and it wasn't in the front of the house. I would keep my big front room as my bedroom, and my mom would switch to the small back bedroom. She would really do anything for us. Looking back, I should have taken the small bedroom for my drums and put my bed in the middle room. That would have left my mom with the big bedroom to share with my grandma. I didn't even think of it at the time, and it's still something that bothers me to this day. My mother always sacrificed everything for her sons. Even though I was still writing and playing with my old creation bandmate Brian Hanna, I also began playing with a band called Asgard, with a guitar player that lived on my new block. I knew neither was good enough for me to do full time, so I continued to keep my eyes and ears open for new opportunities. This was around 1990, and the internet didn't exist yet. There were only a few ways to find new musicians to play with, like placing an ad or answering one in the local music paper. The two papers that I checked out regularly were the Village Voice and the Aquarian. The only other way to find a new band was looking on bulletin boards in all of the music stores. I answered an ad for a drummer in the Aquarian. It said, "Music and look in vein of Guns N' Roses." Guns N' Roses were a new band at the time, and I wasn't really that into their music or look, but I figured I'd give it a shot, seeing as how my new motto was to play with as many people as possible. The band set up an audition at Ace London Studios on Quentin Road in my old neighborhood in Brooklyn. As soon as I walked in, I knew this wasn't the band for me. They looked like rockers, but like the ad said, they had more of that dirty rock and roll image like Guns N' Roses. We started to play a few songs, and they were actually pretty good players, but something about their whole vibe just turned me off. The next day, they called me to tell me they loved my playing and they wanted me to join the band. I politely said, "Thank you, but unfortunately the project wasn't for me." They couldn't understand how I was turning them down and got a little arrogant on the phone. They told me I was passing up a good thing. Still, I knew it wasn't a fit for me, so I wished them luck and the search continued.